Hey, boys and girls, happy Monday. We are going to continue our work with Peter Pan today in our video. And our goal by the end of our lesson, which we're going to spread over a couple of days, is that we are going to be able to recount or retell what happened in chapter 2 of Peter Pan. We are also going to be practicing talking about how the previous chapter builds on the first chapter of our story. So, speaking of chapter 1, let's review what we wrote as our brief summary for chapter 1. So, we said that in chapter 1, we are introduced to the Darling family and their dog nurse, Nana. We also learn about Neverland and Peter Pan through the things that Wendy tells Mrs. Darling. Mrs. Darling is worried about Peter. So we know that Mrs. Darling is very unsure about this strange person that she doesn't really remember, that she finds as she's tidying up her children's minds. And so we also talked about how the purpose of this chapter was to introduce the characters and get us started with the story. So today's lesson, we are going to be rereading chapter 2. On Friday, when you all were in live classes, we read chapter 2 together. And today, we're going to reread it one more time. And while we're reading, we're going to be listening for some key details that are going to help us answer a couple of questions. So I'm going to pull up a copy of chapter 2, Now, Peter, Now. And read, I'm going to have a couple of times where I stop and ask you guys some questions about what we're reading. So, chapter 2, Now, Peter, Now. Children often find even the strangest events rather commonplace. For example, they might casually mention that when they were playing in the woods last Wednesday, they met a ghost or played tag with him on roller skates. It is in just this way that Wendy revealed something quite upsetting to her mother one morning. Mrs. Darling was tidying up the nursery where all of the young Darling children slept and discovered some leaves on the floor. She asked Wendy about them, and Wendy merely replied, "Oh, Peter must have left those leaves." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Darling asked nervously. "He really is quite messy," said Wendy, who was a very tidy child. With a sigh, she explained that Peter often came to the nursery at night and sat at the foot of her bed playing the flute. "Sweetheart," Miss Darling assured her, "the front door is locked at night. No one can get in." "He comes through the window," Wendy insisted. "He can't possibly. We're 3 stories up. Why didn't you tell me this before?" her mother cried. "I just got hungry and forgot," said Wendy, who was now feeling rather hungry again. While Wendy went and looked for a snack, Mrs. Darling stayed behind, still frowning about the leaves. The thing that scared her the most was that she was fairly certain they were from a tree that didn't even grow in England. She searched the room for other clues, but found none. So I'm going to stop at this point right now. We know that in the previous chapter, Miss Darling was really worried about Peter. And now she finds out from Wendy that Peter is coming into the nursery at night. So I want you all to think about, what is Mrs. Darling thinking about Peter now? What do you think she is most concerned or worried about? Think about your answer and I'll share out something in a moment. So I think Miss Darling's biggest concern is the safety of her children. The fact that somebody could crawl in through the window and sit in the nursery without her knowing about it is kind of scary. So I think one of the big things that she's worried about is her children being safe from Peter, because it's a stranger, somebody she doesn't know. Let's see what Mr. Darling thinks about this. "You are making a fuss out of nothing at all," Mr. Darling insisted when she told him. "Now come to bed." "I suppose you're right," Mrs. Darling said. Only he wasn't. The very next night she tucked the children in, went downstairs to sit by the warm fire and sew, and fell asleep. Almost immediately she started to dream. She dreamed of that Neverland, that Neverland had drifted too close to the beach, and that a strange boy had jumped into the water and was swimming towards her children. Wendy, John, and Michael were on the shore, happily waving him in. This might only have been a silly dream were it not for the fact that upstairs the window of the children's bedroom had blown open, and a boy really had flown in and dropped onto the floor. With, with him was a little light, no bigger than a fist, that I'm going to go back. I messed up. With him was a little light, no bigger than a fist, that darted around the room like a mosquito. Miss Darling woke with a start. She knew at once that that swimming boy was Peter Pan. She ran upstairs, threw open the door to the children's bedroom, and sure enough, there he was. He was wearing clothes made of leaves, the same strange kind that he had left behind the last time. But the strangest thing about him was that, although he must have been very old now, at least as old as she, he still seemed to have all of his baby teeth. When Peter saw Mrs. Darling, he bared those pearly little teeth at her and growled. Mrs. Darling screamed, and in a split second Nana was there. She growled too and lunged at Peter. He dodged her and jumped out the window. Miss Darling screamed again. After all, she didn't want the boy dead. She looked down, but saw no broken body. Looking up, she saw what looked like a shooting star speeding away. When she turned, she saw that Nana had something in her mouth. It was Peter's shadow. Nana had nipped it with her teeth right before Peter jumped, and the shadow had snapped off. So before I continue reading, I want you all to think about this idea of somebody leaving their shadow behind. And we know that this story is a fantasy book. And in fantasy stories, a lot of times some things happen that we know can't happen in real life. So one of the things that is in the book is that Peter Pan has the ability to leave his shadow places. So Nana had grabbed his shadow, and now that's left in the room, but Peter Pan is nowhere to be seen. Nana wanted to hang the shadow out the window so Peter could come back and get it without bothering the children. But Mrs. Darling thought it would look like laundry drying. Mr. Darling would be upset if the neighbors had saw that. Instead, she decided to stuff the shadow into the bottom drawer, hidden away like one of her children's unpleasant thoughts. That horrid dog, Mr. Darling said when she told him the next day what had happened. She can't go around snapping off people's shadows left and right. Why, we'll be sued. Poor Nana, and poor Mr. Darling, too. He knew he was being awful and unfair, but he couldn't help it. He was frustrated and jealous about how all the other people were doing better in the stock market, and about the children loving Nana so very much, possibly more than him. It didn't help matters that Nana had brushed up against him yesterday, getting white hair all over his coat. Go to the doghouse where you belong, he yelled at her. George, Miss Darling whispered, remember what I told you about that boy? What if he comes back and Nana's not here to guard the children? But Mr. Darling would not listen. He was determined to show everyone who was the master of the house, and so Nana went. That night, as Mrs. Darling was putting the children to bed and lighting their nightlights, they heard Nana downstairs in the yard barking. She's just protesting being chained up, John said. Wendy was wiser, however. No, that's how Nana barks when she smells danger, she said. Mrs. Darling shuddered. Outside, he saw a million stars, some of which seemed to be hovering around the house, as if they were trying to get in. Oh, how she wished that she and Mr. Darling didn't have to go to a dinner party tonight. Don't worry, Mama, Michael said. Nothing can hurt us when our night lights are lit. Isn't that right? This was something that Mrs. Darling had told the children in the past, so she couldn't very well take it back now. That's right, she said soothingly. Nightlights are the eyes a mother leaves behind at night to watch over their babies. Besides, she told herself, She and Mr. Darling would be close, only a few houses away. What could possibly happen? A few minutes later, Mr. and Mrs. Darling were outside, strolling arm in arm to their dinner party. But they were being observed from above. It was the stars, spying. The old stars were glassy-eyed and bored, but the little ones were curious and full of wonder and winks. They didn't particularly care for Peter, who liked to sneak up behind them and try to blow them out, but they were generally fond of fun, and Peter was all about fun, so they decided to help him tonight. The instant Mr. and Mrs. Darling were safely inside the neighbor's house, a commotion broke out in the heavens. A chorus of the smallest stars in the Milky Way cried out, "Now, Peter, now!" So now that we've finished this chapter, let's think about what is happening so far in our story. When I think about what we've heard so far, we know that there's this Peter Pan character. And in chapter 2, we actually get to see Peter interact with the children. We get to see him interact with Miss Darling. And we also can tell Miss Darling is becoming even more worried. And where we left off in our story is we left with Nana being chained up outside, the parents, Mr. and Mrs. Darling, leaving to go to a dinner party, and the stars telling Peter Pan, "Now, now, Peter, now." So I want you all to take a second and think, what is going to happen next in our story? Pause your video if you need some more time, and I'll share out what I think might happen next in a moment. So if you're still thinking, repause that video. But I think what's going to happen next in our story is we are going to see Peter Pan come back to the nursery. I think he's going to come into the nursery, and I think he might cause some trouble. I think they might get into some sort of trouble in the house. And we know the last time he left leaves all over the house, but I think there's going to be even a bigger mess this time. The last thing that I wanted to talk to you guys about was, what fantasy elements do we see in our story so far? We know that Peter Pan is a make-believe story, and we're going to see things in there that happen that we know can't happen in real life. So I'm noticing a couple just from chapter 2. One of the things I noticed was that the stars were talking and able to think. And in real life, that's not something that is true. That doesn't happen. So stars can't talk in real life, but in a fantasy story, they can. Another fantasy element is that in our story, we see shadows being separated from people, right? Peter Pan has a shadow that was left behind. And I know in real life, the only time my shadows appear is if it's with me, kind of right behind me, reflecting the light. So this is another element that is a make-believe element of our story. So today's activity, you all will be going and starting to begin your brief summary. This activity is something we're going to go do over Monday and Tuesday. So if I were you, I would try just to slowly work at it. And just remember, the summary includes the main ideas, the big things that happen, which is what we've just talked about in our video today. And then second, we're going to answer this question: how does Nana react to Peter Pan visiting the Darling Children's Room? So you don't have to write a lot on this page. Just write a sentence, maybe two, explaining what Nana does to protect the Darling family. Good luck, guys. I'll see you all very soon.